Thank you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, actually on my home ground, and following the wonderful lecture we had previously. I'll try and do my best to make it interesting, informative, and so let's begin the lecture. I will divide my lecture into two parts. The first part is on the PowerPoint. There is no text, and these are by way of preliminary remarks before we turn to the text itself, which you have in front of you. Coexistence is very much in our minds these days. Repeated wars and violence pursued by capitalist democratic states, as well as oppressive states. We have global poverty, illiteracy, degradation of the environment, the nuclear lobby, religious intolerance, the arms epidemic, and yet we still look to the spirit of coexistence and believe. If we look at the situation in Europe, the theme of the moment is Scottish independence. Watch this space. It comes in a few days' time, and all of Britain and many parts of Europe are trembling. What will be the impact of this vote on September the 18th? I was in Edinburgh, where I went to school as a boy and university a few weeks ago, and this is the picture that you can see everywhere. Can or can't? Yes, Scotland can. Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. It's a vote for the dissolution of the Union. It's a vote for the re-establishment of borders. And so coexistence is very much the word of the day. A few days ago in the Guardian newspaper, we had this statement: distinctive peoples have been able to coexist for 300 years. We are desperate for the Scots to contribute, not a divorce, but a renewal of vows. This religious, neo-religious commitment to the union of England and Scotland is revealed in this desperation and panic by London, by many English journalists. Not a divorce, but rather a renewal of vows. It means, of course, the reimposition of borders. And so everywhere we go, from the bus, you can see groups lining the street. This little town where I went to senior high school, going back there as if to greet me was this little demonstration. On the left-hand side, the Scottish National Party, and curiously, on the right-hand side, members of the Labour Party, the Socialist Party of Scotland, who are also now joining the independence movement. This was an ambush. This was a shock to the Socialist Party because, as you know, as you realize, if Scotland gains independence, the Labour Party in England is dead, and we will have conservative rule for another 100 years. Maybe. Yes, we can have independence. The impact on Europe is huge. In Edinburgh, today and this week, there are delegations from Catalonia, from Kurdistan, the Kurds, from Russia, from the Middle East, from South America, from minorities all over. They are in Scotland now waiting for the vote. What will be the impact on them? It's very interesting to look at this separation from a British point of view, because Britain has for hundreds of years been very multicultural, and we celebrate multicultural Britain today, including the Scots, including the Welsh, including the Irish and the Cornish and many other recent immigrant languages. We are very multicultural and in fact multilingual. However, recently the politicians have been proclaiming Multikulti ist tot. Multilingualism is dead. The French Prime Minister Sarkozy and Angela Merkel, there in embrace under the same ideological umbrella, protecting them from the rain and the storm of multiculturalism. State multiculturalism, according to these politicians, is dead. We do not want any more multiculturalism. Enough. Basta. That's Europe. In Japan, meanwhile, from downtown Europe, Brussels, to downtown Japan, Shinjuku, we have, over the last 20, 25, 30 years, an increasing awareness of multiculturalism. In fact, a paradigm shift towards multiculturalism. And I think in Japan, as European politicians cast doubt on multiculturalism, in Japan we are searching for a new vocabulary of multiculturalism. Kyosei, it seems to me, is part of this making of new words, making of new vocabulary to fit a new situation. I include this in honor of Nakamaki Sensei. This is from Minpaku, and as you can see, this is 2004. It's 10 years ago. And Minpaku and many other museums, art galleries, have been exploring Minzoku Nihon, 在日外国人の暮らしと。There's an exploration in many books, a wave of books on roots, which look at the migration aspect into Japan, the mixtures of Japan. The Japanese population itself is umi o watatta hitobito, boat people. Boat people with a substratum of Jomon, if you like, Jomon on the left, Eurasian continental influences on the right. And the notion that, as we can see from Kokuritsu Kagaku Hakubutsukan exhibition, the notion that Japanese culture is a hybrid, a historical hybrid. And here we have a fascinating cultural struggle which goes on in Japan between these two aspects, historical aspects, cultural aspects, as well as a flood of magazines and books and films which look at the hybridity in this dodgy, slightly left-wing magazine, Spa. We had, even 10 years ago, Zainichi Korean Shinsedai Power. And in right-wing magazines, in full support of the LDP, Sapio, we have similarly interesting articles on how foreign populations are powering Nihongo o ugokasu, are powering Japan. The Ainu people have used the word Kyosei for at least 25 years. Kyosei is the word that has been used by the Ainu, Kyosei no michi, to resolve their own anxiety, resolve their own contradictions and anger at Wajin. Now, they say, it's the age of Kyosei, surely. And this video was created 20-something years ago to do just that. So the Ainu people themselves are seriously thinking about the nature of Kyosei, young people, older people, in their publications. We also have a flood of people naturalizing, becoming citizens. These are some Japanese politicians. And statements by Japanese politicians, these are all Japanese. Japan has a reputation of being hostile to newcomers, but we are treated with scrupulous respect and fairness. Japanese are pretty open. And we have, very much in the news, hundreds of sportsmen who switch nationality to Japanese. We have Koreatowns and Chinatowns, and we have the continuation of anxiety. Tamin Kokka Nippon. People looking out, people who have become Japanese, these pictures of 3 people who are now Japanese, but still facing out, looking out to see, does Japan accept us? Does Japan really want us? Is Kyosei cosmetic? It's the focus of much criticism. Non-Japanese criticize Kyosei. They say it's another Japanese strategy. It's a strategy of difference. It's a strategy to create more Japaneseness. Here's the foreigners, and here are the Japanese. Let's have Kyosei together. And we are very clear that it's the Japanese who are superior in this hierarchy, and the non-Japanese are below. Kyosei is cultural nationalism. As one anthropologist said, an American anthropologist said, Kyosei, it's bullshit. It's a vision of national identity, but only on conditions tightly circumscribed. Japanese controls Kyosei. Non-Japanese have no control over it. It's another imposition from Japan. And it's another cover for nationalism, cultural nationalism. That's the criticism. So, anxiety among new Japanese. Football chants, football aggression, hate speech, gaijin kuni e kaere, which was said to Mike Hafner Mike, he's Japanese, and which is said to Lee Tadanari, Japanese only. And he said, on that, the next day after Japanese only, my home is Japan. And yet, we have Kyosei and multiculturalism in Japan. And they look very serious about it. There are Kyosei problems, but there is huge interest, scholarly interest, about Kyosei and Tabunka. The Japanese are very serious about Tabunka and Kyosei. It's not a game. It's not a joke. And Kyosei is being looked at all levels. Here at ICU, we set up the first multilingualism course in Japan, and we started teaching it in 1989. Here are some of my publications and my work on the languages of Japan. There are 14 languages of Japan. Has been the theme of my own work over some years. So it's a new paradigm. And with those opening remarks, I will now turn to Babel. You have a text, page 1, preface, through the prism of language. The thoughtful study of language is what we call is termed sociolinguistics. There are two basic features: the systematic attention to variation, ethnic, social, and regional, and two, the interest in conflict, involving ideology, policy, and expectations. As you can see from my introduction on multiculturalism and Kyosei, my interest is in the second part, and I'm going to discuss multiculturalism and Kyosei against the background of language. Language is not an issue in Scotland. Very strange. Language is not an issue in Scotland. I wonder why. Perhaps we can discuss that later. But language is an issue in Japan and in other places. It seems to me that Kyosei has been threaded into the multiculturalism debate in an interesting way. Kyosei seems to be a Japanese way of enacting multiculturalism. And this latter term is common currency in social analysis. Kyosei approximates, sometimes uncomfortably, to coexistence, conviviality, that's Inoue Sensei's term, or symbiosis. The electronics company Canon, whose corporate motto it is, defines it as living and working together for the common good. As I've mentioned, Kyosei is the signature term in publications of the Ainu people. If we criticize the Japanese for saying that Kyosei is bullshit, then we need to criticize the Ainu too for using Kyosei. I wonder if non-Japanese dare to do that. Probably not. Multiculturalism, or tabonkasei in Kyosei, is a picture so subjected to conventional regard that it is appropriate to try a different prism. I think that language is a core perspective, and Kyosei is a useful perspective because it's about creating reciprocal relationships. Kyosei is about creating reciprocal relationships. And these cannot be done without language. We cannot just create a relationship without talking. We need to talk. And talk is language. Language is the key. I look at this from the perspective of history and time. That is our homework for today. And that's what I'll try to do. Babel. The biblical Tower of Babel is an intriguing tale of language diversity. It narrates the breakdown of coexistence. It is the contrary to coexistence. It's the antonym, the opposite of coexistence. What's the opposite of coexistence? Separation, division. Literally, the opposite of coexistence, I guess, should be apartness. Or, as we say in South Africa, apartheid. That's the opposite of coexistence. It's a curse. Language plurality is a curse. In the tale told by multiculturalism, Babel is a disaster waiting for the word to be redeemed. Logos. In the beginning, the word is God. And now we've created chaos, and now we want it to be redeemed. And in fact, the New Testament is the redemption of Babel. It's the solution to Babel. It's Pentecost. Pentecost is the reverse Babel. Okay. Thomas Bonfiglio refers to Babel as one of the most powerful images in the generation of ethno-linguistic prejudice. It serves as a conventional point of reference for the claims of linguistic primordiality and sanctity. He's referring, of course, to language as national language, language as national property, This is my language. This is our language. National property. A look at the periodicity of representations of Babel is instructive. I'd like to refer to Umberto Eco in his book 1995, who noted that there are only 3 noted representations of the Tower of Babel before the 11th century. So that's before the 11th century, only 3 pictures of Babel. But after the 1550, we have hundreds of them. Quite suddenly, a flood of Babel pictures. What's the cause of this interest? Bonfiglio thinks that the sudden appearance of images of Babel correlates with the anxieties of nationalism, the anxieties of the nation-state. And the suggestion is that the surge in European interest in Babel indicates the competition of new national languages such as Spanish, German, and Polish. I have a slightly different interpretation. My interpretation is not that Babel is a fight between national languages, but rather Babel is a rejection of minority languages. Babel is a pushing away of multilingualism. Rulers cannot permit it for their own good reasons. The pictures of Babel are propaganda. The pictures of Babel are national propaganda. Propaganda to show that if you speak a minority language, you're not welcome in the new world of national states. The confusion you see in Babel is not between French and Spanish. In fact, they are safe, but it's between national languages and other languages. It's an ancient myth, groomed for the modern age, repeatedly invoking the destruction of language. It was a guiding myth. Let me give a 20th century example. In 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. However, it pursued war on the German language at home. German was prohibited. German was America's second language. America pursued a war on German and foreign languages, a war on minority languages, a war on Indian languages. In fact, it did so, very interestingly, for my purposes, in a proclamation which was made in 1917, the year after the war, called the Babel Proclamation. In this document, German was proscribed. Immigrant languages went into decline. There was a drop in the study of foreign languages in US schools. In fact, the President of the United States, commending the Babel Proclamation, said, "America is a nation, not a polyglot boarding house. There can be but one loyalty to the Star and Stripes, one nationality, the American, one language, the English language." And these words we hear today in the USA's English-only language movement. The attack on Babel continues today in the United States. That's the map. That's the program which we still have. Likewise, in the Babel of the 16th, 17th century, only selected languages would be permitted to survive the wrath of God, namely dominant national languages. There's no room for Kyosei. No room for convivial coexistence with smaller, non-national, and even national languages. I will explain that in a moment. No room for languages of the periphery, no room for languages of the indigenous. Now, for my argument, I need one more proof. And the proof, the evidence, is the Treaty of Westphalia. Now, the Treaty of Westphalia was a peace conference in 1644. If you studied European history, and in Japanese schools we do, Sekaishi, you studied the Peace of Westphalia. It was held to end several connected wars that began in Europe in 1618. It was called the Treaty of Westphalia and involved no fewer than 194 states. You see the picture there. This is the official photograph of Westphalia. Yes, all men. Westphalia was the go signal, the go sign, the green light for the most comprehensive assault on languages in Europe seen in European history, consigning hundreds of languages to minority status and many of them to language death. Westphalia did not sign the documents of execution. It cannot be said to be the direct cause. However, Westphalia was nevertheless the ratification of domestic sovereignty, and by default, this led to the need to construct a new Babel with one nation, one language model. One nation equals one language model. Asserting their right to be heard, language communities can change structures and values in their society. Smaller languages change structures. Smaller languages challenge structures, like we saw with calendars. It gives us another view of time. It gives us another view of the seasons, of the world, of society. It's another view. And this may be threatening to elites, and this was threatening to the European elites who stood here in Westphalia. Violence was coming. Plus ça change. Multiculturalism is the effort of peoples to share their world. We want to share our world. We want to share our calendars. We want to share our time. And that's what multiculturalism is. However, Westphalia set the seal on the ensuing European policy of language extermination. The agreement provided one nation, one language model, and that's the official permit to marginalization of language communities. There are hundreds of examples. Perhaps I can give some. Section 1.6. The post-Westphalian program led to a domino collapse of coexistence, the coexistence of languages, the concept of multilingualism. Multilingualism began to break up. For example, Tuscany, Firenze, the capital, was now designated the language of all Italy. Italian is Firenze dialect, Tuscan dialect. And many other national languages, like Piedmontese, which had a long literary and grammatical tradition, becomes a dialect. One day you are a language, the next day you are a dialect. Ryukyu-go. One day you are a language, tomorrow you are Okinawa Ben. You are a dialect. Despite this, during the Risorgimento, the Italian reunification of the 19th century, in fact, the number of people speaking Italian was still less than 10%. In France, meanwhile, the French state vigorously promoted the unification of various dialects. By the French Revolution in 1789, still only half of the population spoke some French. French speakers in France in 1789 were about 12%. If we turn to Britain, one of the 8 Celtic nations, the Celtic territory of the Kingdom of Cornwall, that is in the south west of England, the Kingdom of Cornwall. It's sunny, warm, humid, beautiful. You can do surfing. It's the Okinawa of England, the French Riviera of England. Well, Cornwall became the target of England's favoured military solution to trouble in its internal colonies, extermination. By the mid-16th century, half the able-bodied male population of Kernowak speakers had been slaughtered by military forces from London, including Italian and German troops. In order to impose the English language, the Book of Common Prayer was enforced as the template for religion and English literacy. In a historical study titled Genocide and Ethnocide, the suppression of the Cornish language, John Mills records that priests and population were murdered, texts and traditions were destroyed, children were beaten, and the use of English enforced in education. This continued sufficient to coerce tens of thousands of Cornish speakers into abandoning their native language. For London and Madrid, territoriality became the geographical expression of political power. It's hardly surprising that the word territory derives from both the Latin words terra, which means land, and torium, which means ruler. There's a third cognate which I will not mention here, but that is fear of the foreign land itself. Here's a quiz for you. What's the other word? What's the third word connected with terra, land, and torium, ruler? Of course, it's terror. Terrorism, not terror. The land is fearful. Other people's land is fearful. The land of foreigners is the land of terror. I will skip the next section. 1.8. The notion that language and cultural rights are a human right never fully recovered from the shadow cast by Westphalia. It was not until the adoption of the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages in 1992, under the auspices of the Council of Europe, that agreement was made to protect and promote historical, regional, and minority languages in Europe. Still now, languages that are official within regions, provinces, or federal units within a state, for example, Catalan in Spain, are not classified as official languages and do not benefit from the Charter. France, for example, blocked ratification of this Charter regarding the languages of France. France does not recognize Breton. France does not recognize Corsican, Langue d'Oil, Occitan. France does not recognize Franco-Provençal. We are talking about now, not Westphalia. The rejection of other national languages of France, the so-called unification of dialects, was consolidated into another law. If you thought that France's refusal to ratify the convention is not enough, France decided to strengthen that rejection by making another law called the Tout Bon of 1994. And this was the law more vigorously blocking minority languages. 1.9. In an analysis of To文化共生, Giorgio Shani insightfully links the post-1644 order to the condition of 20th century multiculturalism. I quote, "It is not multiculturalism, but the Westphalian system of territorialized nation states, which equates citizenship with political identity, that has failed to adjust itself to the transformations wrought by globalization. Furthermore, the retreat from multiculturalism or rejection has resulted in greater participation exclusion, the exclusion of ethnic, religious minorities, and living mode exclusion, and thus has led to greater human insecurity for migrant communities in the European Union. It leads to greater insecurity. In this book, Shani examines the l'affaire du foulard, the French headscarf ban, banning the Muslim headscarf, the veil. And this is France's rejection of as Shani describes, multiculturalism. Well, we can look at this headscarf in a symbolic way. We can look at the rejection of the headscarf as also the rejection of another social semiotic, that is, the rejection of languages. You cannot wear your language in public. You cannot wear your Muslim veil in public. You cannot speak your language in schools and in public. So there is a language aspect to the headscarf, the French rejection. The Treaty of Westphalia helped make hundreds of European languages orphans in bondage. And their manumission, their redemption, would have to wait for 300 years. In the age of anxiety, wonder is no longer the origin of philosophy. The origin is now anxiety. The age of anxiety was officially heralded in the late 19th century by the appearance of Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety. Kierkegaard's sole preoccupation was the dislocation of being with others, a kind of Kyosei. The 19th century philosophy was the problem of existential Kyosei. Dissonance is its antonym. Through anxiety, consciousness is directed at the unknown, the terroir, the foreign land, the unknown, unheimlich. Anxiety is an emotion directed at no thing in particular. It's just out there. It's just somewhere out there. How are we to understand this? In anxiety, there is the selfish infinity of possibility which does not tempt like a choice, but disquiets us with its sweet anxiousness. The scream. In the next picture, we are made to share the subject's sense of anxiety, a dread that we have lost our place and continuity in time. The calendars that we saw are an attempt to capture time, are an attempt to maintain cultural time. Are an attempt to establish our place and our continuity in time. Korean in Japan continuity. Ainu continuity in time. It's a way of creating a place in time for us. This well-known painting shows a sexless figure, somehow existentially overwhelmed against a red sky and a bluish-black fjord. It's the quintessential cliché of pop culture, of destination alienation. People like it for various reasons. My mother liked it. And I remember when I was younger, an argument between my mother and father over this picture. She wanted to put the picture in the kitchen. My father said, "This is a ridiculous picture." No, it's a frightening picture. She said, "It reminds me that when I go out the house, I can say to myself, did I leave the gas on? Did I switch off the light? The oven, did I switch it off?" My father said, "Don't be stupid. We don't want this picture in the kitchen." We normally think of this picture as reflecting personal suffering, but it's useful to hear what Munch himself describes, how he describes it. "Walking along the road with friends when the sun is set, I heard the infinite scream of nature." In fact, the full title of the work, Der Schrei der Natur. Munch's classic picture of isolation is almost a trompe l'œil. In fact, we see that he is not alone. One moment he's talking convivially with friends. Look at them on the bridge at the back. You can see other people there. The next moment, the figure hears a cry that throws him into confusion. He's wrenched away with his friends. He's now separated from his friends, so he tries to regroup his senses. The divine-inspired world of nature was a world filled with meaning. Before the scream, the world had meaning. Nature had meaning. Munch's family was devout. His father was a priest. But in this terrible moment, nature fails to respond in its usual way. The angels of nature have flown, and in their place, a cry, a scream. Whose scream is it? Is it nature's? Is it the world? Is it mine? The world seems to have lost its pure voice. It becomes a place of abandoned language, the divine language once known and loved. The next section, 213. The freedom that seems both liberating and terrifying was a running theme through the late 19th century, the age of anxiety, notably Nietzsche, the music of Gustav Mahler, Richard Strauss. It continued through the fin de siècle to reappear in the works of Martin Heidegger, of Jean-Paul Sartre. The scream was a Cartesian emotion. It was Descartes revived. I am anxious, therefore I exist. Anxiety was the new existential theme. Anxiety is the core of my existence. The freedom that seems both liberating and terrifying was a running theme through this century. At the turn of the century, the brutal age of war and empire was in full force. When the natural order loses language, we lose fellowship. We might put this another way. When we no longer understand what is being said to us by people, by nature, we've lost the fellowship of Kyosei, because Kyosei is being with others. Kyosei is being with others. The age of anxiety, characterized by a loss of dialogue, is a failure to dialogue. By the 1930s, it culminated in an extreme spiral of world war and conflict. The poets were fearful. W.H. Auden's prophetic poem on the death of W.B. Yeats spoke directly to the tribulations of being with others. Consider this poem of W.H. Auden. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Dialogue, yet again, breaks down in the hunger wars of nationalism, the living nations, and all that is left is language denatured. This is part 2 of The Scream. Poetry is buried. Language is buried. In place of human talk, we can only bark like dogs. (2.5) Finishing the job, exterminating people. Multilingualism demands our careful listening to the multiplicity of voices that culture brings, that our language contains, what we call multilingualism. It is a linguistic as well as political dilemma. Can language survive, and how can we survive with language? What can language do for us? What can Japanese do for us? What can Ainu and Korean and Okinawan and Deaf Sign, what can the languages of Japan do for us? That luscious richness. The scream was the symbolic sound of the 20th century. World War II completed the destruction of language and language communities that had begun. I skip the next sentence. It was certainly now the age of anxiety. And this was the word on the street, the age of anxiety. The Second World War was the fulfillment of Babel, the fulfillment of Westphalia, the quintessence, the high point of the age of anxiety. During the 20th century, between 500,000 and 1.5 million Roma, you may know them as Gypsy, were exterminated together with the Roma languages. Yiddish was destroyed. As you can see in the picture here, Dutch Jews at Buchenwald before execution. The Yiddish language was destroyed. 5 million Yiddish speakers were destroyed. People were destroyed. Languages were destroyed. And the next generation of Yiddish speakers was destroyed. The European base of the Yiddish language died. Language shift has occurred among hundreds of languages in the world. Thousands of languages now face extinction. We heard about the Ainu language, that faces extinction. There are 6 languages at the UQs. Most of them, all 5 of them, are listed as almost extinct. Many language communities have approached the point of no return. Language shift in communities has become the natural order. (3.1) Off-the-peg narratives handily explain the progress of big ideas. We could chart the rise of multiculturalism as the Enlightenment led to Romanticism, Romanticism led to modernism, modernism begat postmodernism, and in this narrative, postmodernism is multiculturalism. This is not quite correct. 3.2. In fact, there is a family resemblance between postmodernism and multiculturalism, but the original Stimmung of postmodernism arose as much from the intramundane space of interdeterminacy of Samuel Beckett, John Cage, Marcel Duchamp, as Lyotard's incredulity towards grand narratives like the rejection of Marxism and so on. Multilingualism arose from an anxiety about language. That anxiety started with Babel and Westphalia. But it arose as a new principle in education. In fact, multiculturalism was a problem-solving exercise in Canada. In early post-war Canada, it was an attempt to realign the language and cultural aspirations of French-speaking Canada with English-speaking Canada. And then, as multiculturalism in Canada gained speed, the Canadians realized that here is a key. We can use the theories of multiculturalism that we are developing now as a template, as a framework for immigrants and migrants, newcomers. Yes, we can take this educational framework and do something with it. Because the homes of many of these children were Bengali and Portuguese and Lao and Serbian and Chinese and Greek. A new policy for French and English-speaking Canada? Yes. A new policy for migrant languages in Canada? Yes. And so multiculturalism became part of democratic ethics. It responded to a desire to link the complex historical destinies of others in post-war Europe. Everywhere and in every time, migrants are the new weak, the new enemy. It's funny, isn't it? We revolt against immigrant workers in our own neighborhood. We don't want them, not in my neighborhood. And yet, we see no contradiction in sending our sons and daughters abroad to seek work. We resent hearing immigrant languages in our streets. Why is Korean being used on the streets? Why Okinawa? Why these migrant languages? This is Japan. And yet, we see no contradiction in the fact that our own speech, Japanese, our own writing system, Japanese, is immigrant, is a hybrid, a historical hybrid. Our own language is an import, as we saw from Yoshimoto Sensei last week. 3.3. Multiculturalism was a call to social struggle. It picked up as a significant framework for social change in the 1970s. It was a call to social struggle. It was a critique of racism, a civil rights effort against minority marginalization. Now it becomes resistance to racism. Now it's resistance to sexism. It was a harbinger of new respect for minority languages, minority discourse, the language rights of indigenous communities. Somehow, multiculturalism seems to offer a freedom from the need to defend nationalist standpoints and narrow minority practices. I'll skip 3.4, go to 3.5, please. And so multiculturalism is a new world of options. I've recently explored an alternative, banal notion that individuals in the postmodern era are not necessarily bound by group or ethnic orthodoxies. Rather, we possess a repertoire of cultural options, alternative aesthetic choices that we can and do make about ethnicity. Confronted with the jouissance, the joys of urban transcultural flows, globalization is now desktop and it's also downtown. To some degree, we are offered disposable ethnicities, exchangeable ethnicities, lifestyle ethnicities, cool ethnicities. Languages are both group orthodoxies. If you're Scottish, you must speak Scottish. No. If you're Irish, you must speak Irish. No. This is the new world that we live in. Choices are now available to us, as well as coercion, as well as cultural nationalism and petty orthodoxies. I've talked about this notion of portable ethnicity and shifting identity in terms of metro ethnicity. And that's the paper that perhaps you have looked at before this conference. Multilingualism, I believe, actually predates multiculturalism. I've not much evidence for this, but I'm going to try it. The term multiculturalism appeared in the New York Review of Books in 1949. It was a journalist, multi-cultural. But it really only took off, in my view, in 1953, when a Yiddish scholar, Uriel Weinreich, who himself was a Polish immigrant to New York, introduced multilingualism in a very famous book called Languages in Contact, 1953. It's my view that multiculturalism comes from language. It derives from multilingualism. Echoes of the Tower of Babel, visions of the shadow of Westphalia, an attempt to escape from the shadows of Westphalia. 4.2. As I mentioned, the Ainu were among the first to employ this concept. Second paragraph. Multiculturalism and coexistence are a hopeful response to anxiety. Anxiety about speaking in the world. The response translates into a metaphysics of language, into the nature of being. It asks questions, what are we with language? What can we do with language? What can language do for us? What are its limits? In Kyosei, all of us in space and time become concrete persons present to us in space and time. We become present to each other in multiculturalism. 4.3. In multiculturalism, we are talking about how different persons in society relate to each other. Language is the lock and key to personal relations, being a person among other persons in the world through language. Language addresses the nature of being and the world that encompasses it. Language is what we have in common. We all share it. Ainu is my language too. Japanese is my language too. Okinawan is my language too. It's our biological identity. We share it. Language is a shared social dwelling place. Language is the eyes and ears of Kyosei because the effect of Kyosei depends upon dialogue with fellow walkers at the far end of the bridge. We must now turn back to the screen and walk back towards the other end of the bridge. This sexless, faceless figure must turn round and go back and greet his friends and be one with them. 5.1. Multiculturalism is in trouble, and I've mentioned that before in the previous PowerPoint. 5.3. Multiculturalism has its troubles. However, modern liberalism and 20th century philosophy, I believe, laid the path to multiculturalism. I hope you will agree with me now, because its core resides the concept of authenticity, existential authenticity, that is the core of the philosophy of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Heidegger, and so on, because it embraces the politics of recognition. Next paragraph. Even when doors close across generations, we want to preserve links, to hold on and relate through values. We want to preserve links, to interrelate through language, through calendars, through festivals, and so on. 5.5. I think multiculturalism needs a god. And I'm going to suggest here a Greek god, a mythic god. And I think this mythic god is Proteo, or Proteus. Multiculturalism is now the international norm across the world. David Cameron doesn't like state multiculturalism, but he's happy in Oxford, where I live, which is very multiculturalism. He goes shopping there and he buys all kinds of different food. It's state multiculturalism that he's disagreeing with. Multiculturalism is here to stay. Zygmunt Bauman has talked about multiculturalism as a flow. The deity of water, Proteus, is mutable, adaptable, capable of assuming many forms. It's a mything common to many cultures. Proteus is elusive, unwilling to stay and stand to answer questions, a cheeky god, rather transforming and changing identity in order to avoid them. Proteus changes identities. Proteus knows the god has different identities. Proteus does change, like the water, like the sea, like morning water and evening water, the sea in winter, the sea in spring, and the sea in summer. Proteus is perhaps the paradigm of modern multiculturalism. It's the paradigm of the liquidity of life. We do not stand always on solid ground. In the liquidity of life, one language is not enough. One town is not enough. One culture is not enough. One culture, privately owned, nationally canonized and protected, will not do. Culture is always dangerous because it makes us prisoners. And in contemporary society, we are now not prisoners, but sailors. We are expected to learn to navigate the rivers of life, the seas of everyday life. As Shakespeare puts it, to add colors to the chameleon, we change shapes with Proteus for advantage. Multicultural life and how Kyosei forces us to engage in its practice is the basis of Protean fluidity. In this paper, I've tried to peer beneath the surface to observe intellectual history of Europe, which I believe underpins the emergence of multiculturalism. I've looked at multiculturalism through the perspective of language. I believe that language is the key for understanding multiculturalism and how we are living in the cultural flow of society. I believe multiculturalism is going in a very personal direction, and perhaps the Japanese concept of Kyosei points us in an interesting direction. Thank you very much.